I like playing with technology, and I love seeing what it can do to us and how it can sort of change society. It's really, to me, really exciting. I think that voice in particular is this huge, I'm going to say step function better in terms of being able to interact with as a technology. Desktops, big, bulky things, hard to take them with you if you're going to one of those LAN parties or whatever. Became better with laptops and mobile devices. And as it got smaller and easier to take with you, use them a little bit differently. But it became easier and easier. And now we use, smartphones all the time. Now, imagine it being everywhere. I'm fortunate enough, because I play with voice, I have smart speaker in every room of my house, which is nice when it's an old Victorian house and with lots of small rooms. But it's really cool when you can talk to it in different sense and get a feel of that. So with that, I started playing. My manager asked me, what is the technology? What should we be betting on for the upcoming future? And this was about actually 2 years today. I said voice is going to be the next big thing. I don't know how long it will take. It's going to slowly grow, but it's kind of like what the smartphones were before the first iPhone came out, right? They existed. They were used in small niches. The killer app hadn't been figured out. I feel like we're kind of there. We don't necessarily have Apple behind the scenes really perfecting the killer experience, but we have a large community. Amazon is pushing for it. Google's doing a really good job in many places. And I think even the killer functionality, at least from my experience, is likely going to be in a slightly different device than a smart speaker. Actually, from the little bit that I know that we're seeing when we're talking to customers, it might actually be voice on your mobile device. A lot of our customers, they do want to see voice access with their smart speakers, but they are bringing up often like privacy concerns. Like I don't want my data to be accessible to anybody that is in the room, and I don't want to talk about my bank account when someone else is there or them potentially being able to access it. However, if I've got my device here and it's locked, I can press a button and I can say, okay, John, ask it, whatever you want to. Now, exactly how this is all going to come together, I don't know. But what I do feel, just like in the web world and in the voice and in the mobile world, we're going to end up building very sophisticated user interfaces with them, right? In voice, it's going to be spoken, sure. And usually there's going to be not voice only, but there's going to be some amount of voice, some amount of mobile, some amount of large displays, and that experience was going to sort of come together. What's that balance? To be figured out, but there's a lot of insights that we already have today. As I was saying, voice is a natural interface. You've likely seen the two devices on the right-hand side. That's the Amazon Echo, Google Home. My favorite one is to its left. I actually left it at home. It fits in your hand. You can carry it with you. It's powered by two AA batteries. Amazon, for a whole bunch of time, was essentially giving them out free. You'd have to pay $20, and then once you got it, you could get a $20 rebate. They're playing with it, and I think they must have given up way too many of them, so they've stopped making it free. But we're starting to get these really cool form functions, and we can interact with them. And that's why, as Jeff was saying, the projections is, right now I guess it's closer to 25%, but we're expecting as much as 50%, as much as half of the households in North America to be having a smart speaker at their home. Question is, what will they do with it? And then, Amazon and Google have done a lot with it. But it may be worth you going home and asking, what is your favorite project management tool going to be like? There are a certain set of things that I like doing when I get up in the morning. I mean, it does involve like giving a kiss to my wife, But it does involve asking Alexa what the temperature is. What's the weather outside? I'm not looking at a thermometer, right? Like that was something that I used to do before. I like to listen to NPR. There's a whole bunch of things that I like to do, and I would like to check what is the state of tasks on my to-do list. And actually, this is one of the interesting things. It was the first version. I actually tried to build that, in the hello world of figuring out what the tasks are. And I quickly realized that I didn't want to see my entire to-do list. I just wanted to see the top item on my to-do list. With voice, I want to do things slightly differently than what I would with a display. I don't have as much time and patience for everything. But like, what's the most important thing I need to worry? And may not necessarily want to do it all the time, but when I want it, right? So voice is a natural interface, but not today. In most skills that you will see, it's one of those technologies that people that have a smart speaker will say it has like huge potential, but it's disappointing us in many places. And I want to talk about that. But before that, how many of you here own a smart speaker? Okay. How many of you use voice to interact with your mobile device? Okay. So it sounds like there are some people here who are still, who don't use voice with any device today. How many of you don't use voice at all? Okay. Small group of people. There are lots of people who don't have smartphones. It's totally cool to not use a voice device. But for the rest of us, we don't want interactions to just be like how it's on the left-hand side. Right? Today, if you're asking what restaurants, you want to figure out a restaurant where you're going to eat, you'll start by saying what restaurants are nearby, and it gives an answer. And then you say, oh yeah, what restaurants nearby serve alcohol? You're kind of essentially forming this complicated query in a sentence. It's a very command-response driven system. On the other hand, if you're talking to a human being, you'll say, where can I get dinner? But which ones have alcohol? And it's keeping track of the state that you have. Now, you can build some of this logic yourself. And honestly, the first versions of prototypes that I built, that's what I was doing. And then eventually you realize that there's a certain set of common things. And I started building that into a framework that we open sourced about a year ago. And then, since then, I've been talking to a lot of people and getting more, what I would say, user experience design patterns, and been basically making them really easy to build out. It's kind of like, imagine building the first web pages. You might have used more analogies from, print papers, and then realized, that doesn't work as much. Maybe this responsive idea is helpful. Or you figure out these concepts that are helpful, and then you build it out into web pages, into mobile apps, and so on. And that's kind of the journey that I've been on. It's a journey. There's more to do. But I don't think you need to stop till we figure out all the perfect apps. There's a lot that's to be done, and as the civilization, we're going to evolve gradually over the next few years. So, what does it take to build? What are the things that you should think about when you're building a voice app? I don't want to spend too much time on these. In part because, each of these, somebody's going to be not in this room, but if I'm talking giving it a larger, broader audience, someone's going to be annoyed if I talk about any one of these things for a minute or two. These are all half an hour, day-long sessions by themselves. I think the first thing is to think about the use case. Remember that, sure, it's project management. If you're thinking about project management, but there's different use cases that you're going to try to do in voice versus a mobile device. And the rule of thumb I want to say is that people did different things with mobile devices than with the web. Let's say the gap was 10% different. With voice, it's 50% different. It's even bigger gap because you're not seeing it. Then that means there's a whole bunch of differences in terms of how impatient you are. Voice is temporal. It can't give, if it gives you a lot of information, then you kind of get bored of it. So the first thing is to think about the use case. The second one is, and this corresponds to the actual design. right? That you would do on a web app, or which is like figure out how things are going to look together. The simplest analogy here is like if you're a playwright and you're writing what the dialogue is going to look like that's essentially what you do there. There's a lot, of course, to it, and I'll show you a tiny bit. I'm going to focus on this bit, which is the implementing the actual voice part. You can do it for fun at any point in time, just like we do build web apps for fun, right? But ideally, you want to think about the use case and whether the use case matters. You want to think about the design if you want it to all work together. And not ideally, most of the time, this is why I've drawn them in parallel. You get them all together. You need to sort of iterate on all of them. Once you build out the first version of your voice conversation that you're having with the system, and you talk to it, you'll say, it doesn't feel right. Maybe I'm focusing on the wrong use case. And that conversation, as it gets from like this very abstract level to a more concrete thing, gives you a lot of insight in terms of how you want to refine it and how you want to change it. The fourth, I was torn about putting this as the bottommost level, but in practice, this is what happens, is thinking about the form factor. This is about whether it's going to be in a mobile device. And in my experience, because we today do not do much voice-based computing, that is a big enough shock to us that I would try to move this up front. My experience is figure out what this voice implementation is like, build it out, get a potential customer to play with it, and whether the customer is you're building something for your wife or for your parents, like build it out, get them to try to use it, because that in itself is going to be so helpful. And then you can think about, okay, how do I get this working in a web page, or how do I get this working in a mobile device? This general sense, this general feeling usually applies, but there are, of course, more complications. So I'm going to dive into the implementation, but very quickly, I just want to sort of give you a sense of what do the conversation flows. This is a slide I gave at another presentation some time back. I just pulled it out here. What does it look like? If we sort of design it well, it turns out to be something like a flowchart. Because the system is going to do a certain set of responses, but if you say something different, it should give a slightly different set of responses. And so you're kind of building it out. It's a little bit different than a flow chart. There's primitives, there's lots of details to it. But if I have to suggest how to sort of have a mental model of what the conversation looks like, that's a good sense of it. Cool. Let's start digging into the tech parts. Violet was created to make it easy. First, make my life easier, and then, of course, we open sourced it. And to make, my bias is to help the enterprise leverage these emerging technologies, right? So spent a lot of time paying attention to, some of the stuff that's happening in the web world, mobile world, how the technology evolved there. What are the best practices? What does that mean for the voice world? A key part of it is to try to separate out the actual conversation user experience, the flow, from the business logic. You don't want to basically trivialize to put your model view and controller in one piece of spaghetti, right? For small things, that works, but then as it gets non-trivial, that starts to become harder. What we quickly realize also is that you can build voice code that runs on your smartphone itself or on a web page itself, but usually to get it to scale and to look at all kinds of situations, most of your voice logic runs server side. And my weapon of choice has been JavaScript and therefore node.js. But theoretically, a lot of these ideas you can bring it anywhere. The building apps for Google Alexa has a bunch of difficulties. Have any of you built skills? Okay. What you will find out is that if you're trying to build a skill that runs on Amazon, a lot of Amazon's documentation is about using the Amazon platform. And that's cool and great, but you should not need an AWS account for running an Alexa skill. Okay? All of Amazon's documentation requires you to have an AWS account, but it's not actually needed. You just need somewhere to run the service, right? Yes, you can do it on Lambda. I like running it on my local machine and then deploying it to some server in the cloud. I like Heroku. It's nice and it's easy. But depending on what an enterprise might have, they might have their own data centers, so whatever. And so just trying to make a lot of these things easier so that you don't need all these complicated bits is part of what I try to do with Violet. Just make that be easier. Of course, underneath the covers, it's kind of doing the same stuff. So we'll show you a little bit of a voice script. This, how many of you have done some Node code? Okay, a lot of you. If you're comfortable with JavaScript, Node is just running on the server side. It does have a few things that are slightly different. One of the first things is you're loading this module, which is Violet. Once you set it up as you define what are you going to be using for, where you're going to be doing any input or output. In this case, I'm defining a food item as an input type, and then you can say, any restaurants close by that have salads, right? This is what it's expecting, and you would respond back saying sure, looking it up. You can put in the business logic. In this case, defining an object here, you're calling it. It gets there, but this is a separate object that you're sort of providing all the logic there. And then the conversational flow hierarchy. I'll talk more about this in a bit, but that's what pulls it all together. Does that make sense? How many people have I lost? Okay. So this is a really simple, trivial voice app. It's worth noting that there is this HTML-like syntax. It's not React. I'm talking to people, trying to see what and how much can we pull in those ideas. It does need to run on the server side. And I'd love to talk to somebody and make that jump at some point in time. But I, as a huge fan of React, and Facebook had this framework called XHP some time back. I don't know if you guys played with it. I love the idea of being able to sort of organize your logic and in these components, and that's kind of what you get. What it's doing behind the covers is it's tracking state for you. It's got lower level APIs, and you can talk to those lower level APIs. But it's tracking the state. It's trying to see that Dave. Where is Dave? Somewhere. There he is. Dave said X, Y, Z, and John did not say it. John is in a different part in this conversation model that I built. And so since Dave is saying, okay, this is the context, this is what he said, this yes applies to this bit as opposed to this other bit. And of course, it's got a bunch of logic to have an organized primitives that we can think of in a conversational flow design world. Okay, so let's get something concrete with a game management app. I was asked to build this example. Let's say we want to have a game night, and we'll start by creating a very simple dialogue. To say which game nights have been planned. Here are the planned game nights. Which ones are coming next? Of course, this is a starting version of it. It's fine to start with a bad dialogue when you're writing it on a piece of paper. Hopefully, you're not implementing this. You can design it a little bit better. Now that you're getting this information, right? It's taking advantage of your of the context. You're writing these sample scripts. It's considered one of the best practices. Then once you've got a bunch of these examples, then you can sort of implement it. It's worth remembering that when you start with the basic, here's the set of features that you want to support, then thinking about what is the beginner experience going to be like. And that will help you, maybe you do that as a second iteration, but it'll help you figure out how you're going to build something good. So once we've got this, we can put down some code for it. And, in this case, what has been planned, right? We're putting it as a choice. We're saying sure, and we want to ask the user a question. Would you like the game nights that are in the past or in the future, right? If you're making that question, so we say that this is a decision the user needs to make. Ask this question. If the user says what's coming up, then I want you to run this code, right? So it's your nested, let's call it a decision tree of sorts. A decision inside a decision inside a decision. You can just put them in forever and model where the conversation is going to go. And this is a really important and very common design pattern that you will see at a high level. It is the fact that that things are going in as nested trees. If you look at a web app, it's easy to say that one of the most common primitives in a web app is menus. There's menus and sub-menus of different kinds. The same way in a voice app, one very common primitive. It's not the only one, but it's just to think about nested decisions that a user needs to make. And the second common thing in a web app, in a mobile app, is the form. It's that you want to do something, you have to enter in these 3 pieces of information, and you can do it, right? In the voice world, it's called a dialogue. Sometimes they call it a multi-turn conversation. And the basic idea with this example of our game night is, I'm looking to organize a game night, and then the system needs to ask, what day would you want it to be? When would you like to start? And so on. So these are the different pieces of information that you need from the user to fulfill this, let's call it a form, right? And so you say dialogue, giving it an ID. This elicit is basically saying, get all the required parameters. Dialogues can have optional parameters as well. What are the names? And ask this question to elicit from the user, and this is what you're expecting from the user, and that goes in there. Once it gets the different pieces of data, it calls business logic, and then it should be done.
Does it know the data types of day and time, or do you have to handle that sort of parsing yourself?
It has a certain set of data types that it does know. And so if I go back to the first slide, this is the add input types. This is where you define the types. We support a bunch of sort of the commonly accepted types, in both the Alexa and Google Home do process a bunch of things. However, the types is definitely one of those places where you will feel a bunch of pain, and you'll wish that the system can handle. I don't know. I was making a recipe app of sorts. It doesn't figure out things like chicken as easily, or some words it gets it completely wrong. So my recommendation there is do the best you can, and people that are using these voice apps also do know that recognition isn't perfect, but whatever you can do, try to. Amazon does have ways to give it lots of examples. You can give 200, 300 examples, or you can say that these are the only, the days of the week. I don't know if it is one of the supported, I don't remember right now if it's one of the supported things, but you can say these are the 7 days of the weeks, and then you can create your own type. Yeah.
Do you have multiple?
Yes. Yeah. I'm actually thinking of changing the format of it, but yeah, absolutely. Multiple expectings is, I'll get into that, is a really, really common way. People say things in different ways. But also, like multiple expectings, the say you can have. So if you have multiple says, it says them one after the other, but you have a element called say one, and it will say any one of these things. And it makes the system not sound monotonous. Yeah? Yes, at this point, that is a requirement. So a little bit of both, right? So for the system, is the limitation that this script has to be static a limitation of Alexa, or is it a limitation of Violet? What is the limitation of Alexa is the fact that there's a limited number of expectings, essentially, in the system. It needs to know what are the different things ahead of time that a user can say. And as long as we're meeting that, Violet can handle it, and there is a way to do it. However, most of the time, unless you're creating a special component and there's a way to create components and your own tags, most of the time it is better to just think of it as a static thing and add little bits to it just to sort of for modularity's sake, as opposed to trying to make it overly complicated. Does that make sense? And again, we can talk more about it. I'd love to hear the use case you're thinking of. I've found in my experience just working and refining on this. And of course, you can put in business logic and you can say that this gets triggered at this point and so on, is, in my experience, has been the key to getting things working really well. Okay, moving forward, there's not too much more here to say other than at a high level, if you're thinking about building a voice app, try to break it down into menus and these forms, decisions or dialogues, we call them, and figure out how to put the logic separately. And of course, iterate, test. Like I feel like I'm a huge proponent of being agile and getting feedback from people, but the voice world forces that on you like you've never thought that. It confuses things like the word how and the word wow. And like, oh yeah, of course, it kind of makes sense. But not necessarily when you're like building the system and you're realizing, oh right, this is a little bit confusing and that's why it's doing this other thing. And you can do a lot in terms of prompting the user and changing so that the user can be comfortable to say things the way he or she wants to, but at the same time also the user can, you can guide the user better so that there aren't as many problems. Okay, I don't want to spend too much time on this. There's a lot of little details that I've thought through that's been of this evolution in the last year. A lot of frameworks that you will get if you're building skills are going to be more command response based, sort of low level. I think of it as event based programming. At the DOM, like if you're building a web app, like at the DOM level, listening to events and changing things. If you wanted like the evolution for apps, and then most voice app developers has been going beyond that to tracking state yourself to actually thinking about the entire conversation flow. And so I personally like to understand the details in many places, and if you want to, we can talk more about this stuff. But if I'm suggesting somewhere of sort of where to sort of plant yourself, that's in terms of like how do you make this sort of design that's been figured out happen. Oh. It's something that we as humans do a lot. If I'm grilling someone, it's me taking initiative and me asking you question after question after question. What humans do is I'll ask you 2-3 questions. I'll pause a little bit to give you a little room to breathe, and I'll let you ask questions, and we'll try to meet meet in the middle. That's the dream, is you want to support a world where the system is asking the user questions to meet the user's original question and need, and you're trying to find a solution at the end. Does that make sense? Yeah. So at the high level, if you're, we talked about menus and decisions. You can define your own components as well. We've tried to create list widgets. You'll realize that, if you ask me what's on the menu for today, there may be a bunch of different items. Best practice is not necessarily to say all 5 things. Say the first 2, 3 things and saying, do you want to hear more? Or do you want to remove one item from the menu, or so on. Again, there's lots of details, and different list widgets may be different, but we built one common library, I'm going to say plugin, that component that we're using. We know, I haven't had to, but I know one of the companies in the Boston area is building the medical, was helping companies in the medical space build voice apps, and they were trying to do these sort of intake interviews with customers. And so they were using, and this has gone dark. Anyway, Flux, right? Yeah. So anyway, so that can so you can build more components, and then you don't have to actually put it in the logic. Once you get to that, there's a few lower level primitives as well. It's the idea of whoever I was asking whether you can have multiple expectings. You need to support alternate inputs, alternate responses that I was talking about. The response is based on experience level. If you're really trying to do something good, the first time a person talks to a system, he's a beginner. You want to give more elaborate prompts. But the 10th time, the 20th time the person is talking to the system, you want it to be much shorter and condensed. Right? That's people expect that. You don't have to give in all the details. And so figuring out and doing a great job with that can improve the experience a lot. Similarly, when do you ask the user one question, or is it worth asking the people 3 questions at a time? And so this gets a little bit more involved. I wouldn't suggest worrying about this too much right up front. Get a basic experience working, and then this is where you geek out to make the experience amazing. So I have a calculator example as well. It's a link there. I can walk through it, but I don't want to necessarily take too much time. Check it out. HelloViolet.ai. Feel free to reach me out on Twitter. I'd love to hear of anywhere that you guys get stuck, or if you're being very successful, please tell me about that as well. I think there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be building voice apps, are going to need voice apps. So I'm trying to convince people to think about it properly, so that they can be successful with it. And I'd love to hear who else is playing with it. I'll be around for some time. And you can wait now. Listen to the main, to the next speaker, right?